Welcome back. In the 87th regular session in 2021, House Bill 2831 mandated the establishment of the Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Advisory Committee by the Texas Commission on Jail Standards, TCJS. This committee is tasked with providing guidance on matters concerning individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities, IDD, in county jail settings. Jenny will help us foster a more informed approach to handling IDD cases within the justice system. Jenny Goode is the CEO of the Betty Hardwick Center, the Mental Health and IDD Authority for Callahan, Jones, Shackelford, Stevens, and Taylor counties. Please help me welcome Jenny Goode.
Good morning. I get situated here. Well, as you likely have noted, Brandon is not with us today. And so Brandon Wood is Executive Director for the Texas Commission on Jail Standards, and he became ill this week and was unable to be here. And so I'm going to fly solo this morning. As was mentioned, I'm the CEO for the Betty Hardwick Center, which is located in Abilene. And I've been there for about 27 years. So I don't run a jail. I don't work at the Jail Commission. I'm not a law enforcement officer, but I have about 27 years of experience with all of the above in working with our client population. And so I hope today to be able to share with you a little bit about the services that we are able to provide across the state in partnership with our law enforcement folks. So today we're going to talk about several things. I'm hoping to help you gain an understanding about intellectual and developmental disability. I realize in a room this size and people who are attending a conference like this, there are probably people with expert knowledge on this subject in the room. But there may be some people who are not quite there yet on who this population is and what are the issues that they're facing. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk about some education and training ideas and some things that are happening around the state of Texas, community-based services that are available to this population, crisis and law enforcement initiatives, and jail partnerships. I have a lot of experience in Abilene and in the 4 surrounding rural counties in my area, but some of the things I'm going to share with you today are from around the state of Texas. So I work in Abilene, but there are 39 local IDD and mental health authorities around the state, all of which have similar services, but some communities take a slightly different approach. And so we're going to look at all of those while we walk through this. So let's talk a little bit about what is an intellectual disability. An intellectual disability is a condition characterized by significant limitations in reasoning, learning, problem solving, and practical social skills. You might have heard yesterday during the final session that a law in Texas was passed this session to change the term mental retardation to intellectual disability across all of the code that's written. This has been a work in progress for many years, but what we find sometimes is that when we use the term intellectual disability in the community with lay folks, they don't always understand exactly what it is that we're talking about, which is really found in the bullet points of this particular slide. There's a lot of different causes for mental retardation or intellectual disabilities. And what we know is that people with intellectual disabilities face higher rates of abuse, neglect, and exploitation than the general population. In Texas, there's about 500,000 people with intellectual disabilities who live in our communities. Many people who have intellectual disabilities also have a co-occurring disorder. This is something when we talk through the services that are available, a lot of times in the community, if you call, you have a person that you encounter, particularly with law enforcement or at jails, the response system that you get first is the mental health crisis system, because that is the one that's more widely available 24/7. And so we're going to talk about how that particular crisis system intersects with IDD services that are available. But in reality, about 30 to 35% of people with intellectual disabilities also have a co-occurring psychiatric disorder. Commonly occurring disorders are major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, anxiety, impulse control disorders. Many of those folks also are on medication for those conditions. Although there are a lot of psychiatrists in the community, many of them don't have a lot of training with intellectual disabilities. And so this can be a challenging population to treat. And often what happens is medications get changed a lot for this population in crisis circumstances. And so there can be a lot of complications in terms of treating these co-occurring disorders. People with IDD also experience trauma, abuse, and neglect at higher rates than the general population. So obviously, if you're here in this room, when I come to a session like this, or I'm trying to decide which session to attend, it's because I'm hoping I'm going to pick up something I can take home with me, right, and do better. This is an area in Texas where we recognize, and I think, as you heard in the introduction, the legislature recognized that we have a need to do better in Texas with people with intellectual disabilities. And some of this is why less than 4% of our population in Texas has IDD, but 10% of prison and jail population has those disabilities. And people who have IDD are more likely to face additional challenges. They may be at increased risk of being arrested, convicted, incarcerated, and they sometimes serve longer sentences without probation or parole compared to their peers who don't have IDD. So for that reason, we want to work together in our communities to try to develop some better services across the intercepts to help this population. And so we're going to use the sequential intercept mapping table to move through these items. We're going to start talking about education and training that are available. So there are a lot of ways that local IDD authorities and law enforcement are working well together across the state. We're going to look at a few examples. So many local mental health authorities offer mental health first aid training. There are special courses that are available for law enforcement or first responders. There are resources online from the START group. There's an online course for mental health and mobile crisis responders. That's about a 6-week series. It's a virtual series that's offered several times a year. In our community in Abilene, our first responder teams have done that training. You log on and you do it weekly for about 6 weeks, but it walks through some of the special needs that people with intellectual disabilities have and what sometimes a crisis might look like, what's causing the crisis for them, and it's complicated things like sometimes untreated physical health conditions can manifest themselves in this population with challenging behaviors that result in a need for additional intervention that sometimes looks like aggression or a crisis, or maybe they've just decompensated in some way. Those are complications that sometimes take place. So this particular training series offers some information about that. It's available to anyone online. LIDA and local IDD authorities and mental health authorities can do training for law enforcement. Some examples of this that peers responded with to say that they're involved in their communities are, one example, the Center for Life Resources in Brownwood offers this training to the police department, and they talk about with their police officers what services are available, best ways to approach those with IDD issues and to connect them with ongoing care. Emergence in El Paso trains at the Sheriff's Academy each year, or each time there's a new class in the academy, and they talk about IDD, autism, dementia, and other materials. They also can offer the training for cadets, jailers, and any other law enforcement branch. I think this is pretty common around the state of Texas for local IDD authorities and mental health authorities to participate in training of law enforcement. In addition, there's also the TCOL CIT courses that are a little bit longer in nature, and some of those are offered in each region. In Brownwood, they talk about that how when they offer this class in their community, they involve people with intellectual disabilities in the course. So they come and do role play with officers so that officers will have an opportunity to interact with a person with intellectual disabilities and help them prepare for how they might communicate with folks to get to the bottom of a situation to help with that. So there's a lot of different opportunities there. Also, as a result of the legislation that the judge mentioned, TCOL created a training to help jailers identify and interact with persons with IDD. And it is now a training that's available across the state for people who work in jails. So across the state, there's a number of community-based services available for people with IDD, but admittedly, it is a system that can sometimes be challenging to understand. We're going to look at this. So this is a map of Texas and a map of community centers in Texas. I mentioned there are 39, so every county is served by a local mental health authority. In many cases, the local mental health authority and the local IDD authority are the same. People who have co-occurring conditions may be receiving services from the local behavioral health or IDD authority. The IDD authority has several roles to fulfill in the community. Many of them are administrative in nature, but some of them involves providing of services in the community for people with intellectual disabilities, such as service coordination, respite care, day programming, supported employment, and skills training services. LIDA staff also employ crisis specialists who work with the IDD population specifically. And we're going to talk more about that as we move through our slides in terms of crisis services. But these folks are available and serve as a resource to law enforcement. Residential services can be one of the complicating things to understand for folks in the IDD service arena. So many people with intellectual disabilities live at home with their families in our community. They may live independently in their own apartment or home, but some individuals in our state live in residential programs. This brochure that's provided by the Texas Health and Human Service Commission explains what those services might look like. So in Texas, there are 13 state-supported living centers that serve persons with intellectual disabilities with significant medical or behavioral health needs. They're served in a residential campus based in these 13 communities. There are also community-based ICF ID homes. So these homes vary in size, usually 6 beds and higher. These are located in neighborhoods around your community. These homes provide 24-hour care and comprehensive services to the people who live in them. And then additionally, there are home and community-based services homes. Those homes tend to be 3 to 4 beds, and they are located in neighborhoods all over the community. And they're also 24-hour care that provides nursing, residential supports, and in many cases, law enforcement or other people in your community may encounter people who live in these homes when there are challenges, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. Local authorities are are the front door and the back door to all of those services. They help people explore residential services and make a choice about where they want to live, and they can also help them if they move out of those situations. They also provide the crisis care for them, and in some cases, service coordination for the people who are living in home and community-based services homes. I think this is a little jumpy. Let's go back. So we'll spend some time talking about crisis and law enforcement services. How many of you work in law enforcement in the audience? Jails. How about jails? A few. Okay. So in all areas of the state, if we're looking at crisis services that are available, there are hotlines that run 24/7. In some cases, there are clinicians in dispatch who might help direct a call up front. And one example, Blue Bonnet Trails, they have embedded, which is in Round Rock, they have embedded clinicians in dispatch who provide immediate intervention. Sometimes that might result in deploying mobile crisis outreach team staff to an address where a person is, or a crisis intervention staff person. And then the dispatch staff follow up after the fact. This is considered, this is a growing practice that's becoming more common around the state to add clinicians in dispatch. The goal of that in many cases is to try to intervene earlier in a crisis situation and send clinical resources in lieu of law enforcement when possible. Certainly in circumstances with people with intellectual disabilities, sometimes that resource might look a little different in terms of a crisis response depending on the nature of the call. Because of the prevalence of co-occurring disorders, sometimes people with IDD are also being served by the local mental health authority. And in those instances, mobile crisis outreach teams may be the responding team, the responding professional to come to the call. Mobile crisis outreach team members can be bachelor's or master's level mental health clinicians who are trained to do assessment in the field, and when they respond, they do an assessment and help identify the next best resource for the individual. There's a lot of different models that grow out of mobile crisis outreach teams. Some of them are co-responder models, and there are a couple of examples here. So in Abilene, we have community response teams. The top picture there is an example of those teams. It involves a mental health crisis worker, a police officer, and a paramedic. Those teams are able to respond on site when a call comes through. They're typically dispatched through 911. So if a call comes to 911 that seems to have a behavioral health or an IDD component, the team self-deploys, they respond to the call, and they're able to do an assessment on site. Obviously, having a paramedic on the team means they have some ability to do mobile lab work in the field, and the officer is on the team to provide security and also mental health warrantless detentions if needed for commitments to particular psychiatric facilities. StarCare has a co-responder program in Hockley County. Burleson County has a mental health initiative that looks a lot like this, with a team that operates together jointly with law enforcement. Around the state, there's quite a few models of CIT, which is an officer and a mental health worker. So co-responder models are very common, and across the state, those teams are equipped to respond to both mental health calls and calls for persons with intellectual disabilities. In many cases, if the IDD crisis specialist is not embedded with the mental health crisis team, they also can be deployed and come with them, or they may receive a referral after the call. So that might look differently depending on what your community chooses to do to handle that. Every community has an IDD crisis specialist. They just may locate them differently within the organization. There are also IDD crisis respite units or services around the state. Those may look a little different in each community as well. In our community in Abilene, we have a 6-bed facility where we're able to do crisis respite services. In many communities around the state, those crisis respite beds may exist in group homes or on an as-needed basis in the client's home with staff that respond and stay in the home. So it can look different around the state. I've mentioned the IDD crisis specialist a few times, and I want to talk about this a little bit more. If you're not familiar with this position in your local community at your IDD authority, this would be a great starting place for you when you go back home. All LIDAs have IDD crisis specialists on their team. These people have special training to work with people with IDD, so they can help determine what's the cause of the particular problem that we're having and explore solutions. And in a lot of cases, people who live in group homes in the Home and Community-Based Services Waiver Program have access to, their provider provides 24-hour care, and it's comprehensive. Included in that are things like behavioral support. So if the person has behavioral health needs or challenging behaviors, they may have a behavior support plan in the community. This crisis specialist can work with that person. They can also work with their treating psychiatrist and the nursing team and the provider agency to provide some assistance for them and to find out what's happening and the goal is to try to prevent disruption in their living situation and also to help resolve the crisis with appropriate medical services. And so this staff person typically is mobile. They work in the office, but they can go to the home, they can respond with law enforcement. So this looks different around some of the things that happen around the state of Texas is some communities have set up a direct line for law enforcement to reach out to the IDD crisis specialist to make referrals to them directly. In Abilene, one of the things that we did early on was provide our 911 dispatch office with the addresses to group homes in our community. And each month they send us a report of how many times 911 was called to those residences. And we can see what the nature of the call was. So we proactively follow up with those individuals to see if the situation has been resolved or if they need assistance. I think that might look different depending on, one of the challenges, I think, in operationalizing this in each community is the way law enforcement codes calls. If they have a particular code for IDD calls in their system, you could perhaps set up a system for that too, so that people who live in the community but maybe who aren't connected to services or aren't living in a group home could be proactively reached out to by law enforcement. This happens, Emergence, the center in El Paso, their crisis specialist has a system like that. So one of the things that they identified over time in working with their local law enforcement is that many of the people who they were getting 911 calls on in the community were people who were not connected to services already. And so perhaps they live at home with their family, or something has happened and they're not living with their family. They may be unhoused, or they're just in the community with unmet needs. And so when they would call, 911 would be called, the law enforcement officer would respond and address the call, but often did not have, prior to this relationship, might not have had a way to make sure they stayed connected to services. So the staff at Emergence talk about receiving that call, they follow up with the person after the call, and they maintain them on a crisis caseload for a period of time until they can assure that they were connected to services and receiving supports. Sometimes it involves family education about services that are available, connecting them to psychiatry appointments or residential options if that's a need the person has. But really it's about communication, largely. Sometimes, I was looking through some of the lists from other centers. Center for Life Resources in Brownwood talks about that they allow, or they have established a direct line for law enforcement to call their crisis specialist so that they just call directly to them when they have a call. That helps them sometimes cut off a situation that might develop into a more serious event just by having preventative outreach. There's a slide directly from El Paso. They really connect at emergence. Their IDD crisis services are tightly connected with their mental health crisis response team. They talk a lot about the steps that they take to develop resources for the person, how they then develop a plan and do some follow-up post-crisis. Sometimes that involves debriefing with care providers, group home staff, families, and doctors. They also, the goal here is not to take over the person's services, but really to complement them and to try to help connect them to new resources. In the other session this morning, they're talking about diversion centers. A lot of conversation is taking place around the state as these models are evolving. They look different from place to place. In some centers, like Denton in Denton County, theirs is considered more of a triage model. People can arrive there and be assessed and triaged and moved on to services. Almost all of the centers that are developing with the idea that people with all diagnosis groups can be served there. This scale from Bluebonnet Trails is a representation of their crisis continuum. And one of the things that they share about their service steps is that it's not diagnosis specific. That regardless of where you respond or you connect to their crisis continuum, regardless of your diagnosis, a person with an intellectual disability has access to services just like a person with mental health condition would. And as you access their services, they help you connect to whatever's the most appropriate for you. When you get to the intercepts with jails and services and partnerships that are in place with jails, it really connects to an important part of the legislation that was passed. One of the things that has been in place for many years is TLET's data matching for people with mental health conditions. And so following the legislation that was approved in 2021, House Bill 2831 required the Texas Commission on Jail Standards to establish the advisory committee to collect and review data and develop recommendations and guidelines on the incarceration of people with IDD in county jails. But it also worked to improve the methods of identifying people using this TLETS data. So when a person is arrested and booked into jail, their name is entered into the jail's booking system, and then it goes up and matches against the state of Texas's care system. And so we use that to identify each day when people are booked into jail who have mental health or IDD conditions and a treatment history. And so what happens with that data right now is if there are matches on a particular person that says they have a history of IDD services, that gets sent to the LIDA staff. The crisis specialists that we've talked about already are able then to follow up with people in the community and in jail. and then also to coordinate with their family and service providers as appropriate. So this is another way people are referred to services, or another way they can access services, but it's a really important one. One of the things that we have identified in our own community with this data is that sometimes by the time we receive the information, the person has already been released from jail. And so we have an opportunity then to find them in the community, which can be challenging if they're not service connected, right? So we have set up some other ways for people to be connected at the jail. So this particular table, again, comes from Williamson County, and their intercepts 2 and 3 here are on the screen. We talked about already how they offer those for people regardless of diagnosis, but there are several in intercept 2 that are particularly relevant for people with IDD. Pretrial diversion opportunities, for example, are one of the ways in which jails and initial court hearings that happen while people are in jail can serve people with intellectual disabilities. Around the state, that looks a little bit differently depending on what resources communities have in jails. So this picture is one of the examples that we have in Taylor County, where we have jail navigators. So we serve 5 counties, but these staff, the jail navigator staff, are located in Taylor County Jail, and they serve the rural counties virtually. They're funded by the City of Abilene and all of the counties and the local IDD authority or mental health authority. We all combine funding to be able to employ these folks. Their role in our jail is they of course do crisis screenings as they emerge in booking, but they also try to do pre-booking diversion. So as a jailer brings a person in and starts processing the booking, they ask them the questionnaire that every jail uses for every inmate. And if a person is identified in that screening process as having a mental health history or an IDD history, right at that moment in time, they identify them to the navigator, and the navigator has an opportunity to intervene. Pre-booking diversion is a possibility in that instance. It has some challenges sometimes, depending on the charge and the officers involved in their discretion. But when possible, we try to divert people at that point. If people are booked into jail, we have some post-booking options that then we exercise. But these positions being located in a jail sometimes kind of help with the other issue that I mentioned, that if you don't have a person physically present, the TLETS booking happens a little bit after the fact, right? Like the data gets entered, it goes up and hits the system. And so if we're just waiting on the after effect of booking, sometimes the ability to intervene happens a little bit later. So this is a really good practice to have in booking. This looks different around the state. Of course, Abilene's navigator option is just one option. Some communities have staff that locate in the jail all the time. This is Stark here, for example. I don't know if any of them are in this session, but they're here. They have a special needs pod at their jail there in Lubbock. They do diversion and screening options up front. They serve a variety of populations, so they have a robust system for people who have mental health issues and may need jail-based competency, but they also have the same diversion opportunity established for people with IDD on the front end. And so, all of these services have the ability to be kind of built out to be more robust. But there are ways to do this. I mentioned in Abilene, we started it without outside money, right? Like our community said, we want to do this. How are we going to do this? And we started with one navigator position during the busiest booking hours, and we just combined funding together. Some other communities, much larger communities, have a whole pod, or a very robust list of services that are available in jails. So there's a lot of different ways to get at this, but the main thing is just to form a partnership, right, and communication between the different parties. I think maybe the best way for us to make sure that any question that you have gets addressed is to open it up for questions. If there is a particular issue or a point that you would like to know how to access IDD services or work better with your IDD partners, does anyone have questions about that? You want to come up to the mic? You have to come on up. I'll let you, while you're walking on up to one, you don't want to come to the mic? Email the PowerPoint. I think it's on the website already. So if you go to the website for the conference, okay. He's going to come to the mic so the people online can hear the answer. The question was, can you access the PowerPoint slides?
When we get to a break, the break slide of the PowerPoint has the link for the website on it. That's where you can get the PowerPoint.
Okay, very good. Any other questions? Can
you come up to the mic, please?
Suggestions that you guys would have for an LMHA or a LIDA in terms of where to start with funding to initiate a jail navigator?
So I'm going to repeat the question so that people online who might have missed the front end of that says, do you have a suggestion for how to access funding for a jail navigator type position in your community if you don't have one today? So yes, I do have some suggestions for that. So a couple of different opportunities. One, Senate Bill 292 projects that are available for competitive application are one source because they fund projects that you can use services in jails, right? So that's one source. Secondly, I talked about the way that we funded ours in Abilene. We started with prior to having jail navigators, if there was a crisis at the jail, we sent our crisis staff. And we knew what the data was on that. So we felt like we could fund the crisis aspect of that at our center, a portion, but we couldn't fund all of it because we're not really, you can't use some state funding for services in jails. But the jails were like, we're interested in this. We're so interested in reducing the population of people in our jail that we'll contribute to the cost. And so all 5 of our counties contributed a prorated amount to support the first position. Well, the first position really was Taylor County funded, but then they loved it so much they wanted us to add a second one, and then our rural counties all participate in that. The city of Abilene also participated. In Taylor County, the population is large. When you split that across multiple people, or payers, the cost isn't as significant to be shared. So that's one way. Obviously, there are a lot of grants that are available for criminal justice opportunities. And in some ways, that can be a good way to get started and then prove up the efficacy of the program and the impact, and then communities may buy into it a little bit more going forward. We did that with our community response teams. We had some federal grants that participated in that provided us funding to do that, and now it's become such a fixture in our community that our agencies are all pitching in our part for our positions on that. Other questions? Or maybe you live in a community that you think does something really great for IDD services that we didn't talk about. Would anybody want to share your own experience with that? Okay. Very good. All right, well, thank you for being here. If there are no other questions, we'll be outside at the table for a few minutes after this. We'll finish a few minutes early. I think you have about 6 extra minutes. All right.